I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is Trilloquy, true and real stories from the fringes of classical music. How you doing today?
Everything's good so far.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of day left for things to go south, but
Yeah, of course. Well, there always and a lot of time for things to go even further north. So,
that's true.
Yeah, or further east in your case. Shout out to living on the east side.
Oh, you mean the east side of St. Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, East Siders, man. That's they're the tough ones.
What you mean
of
by
St.
that?
Paul. What's that?
What you mean by that? They're the tough ones.
East side of St. Paul has historically been working class, people who work blue collar jobs, manual labor.
Right. And, me and Dell, when we moved to St. Paul, I rented our apartment sight unseen, so I didn't really know anything about
You scored.
the neighborhood or anything. I was just trying to find a place to drive, come up here with the U-Haul and have a place to put it all, without me feeling stressed out in a hotel room and all that, so it definitely worked out. And, the neighborhood we lived in, we landed in is good. And it's difficult for me because it is very much, an upper. I mean, you can tell me more about that neighborhood than I can. I've only been there for, some months now. But
I'll never afford to buy anything in that
right,
neighborhood.
and see, and that's the problem because for me, I look at some of these homes that look very, modest, and I know that I just can't afford to buy there, and I feel like I should be able to. I feel like I have a pretty good job and my attraction to staying in that neighborhood isn't because it's safe or because it's whatever, but because of the proximity to public transit. Yeah, I'll tell you, if I could jump on, the express bus or a train or something over where you live, I would have no aversion to buying a home over there. But again, I don't want to have the stress of trying to figure out how I'm going to get to work in the snow. I'm a Southerner, so
Yeah.
seeing 4 inches of snow on the ground is a lot for me, much less a foot. And you mean to tell me I still have to come to work? So
Oh, yeah.
I'm doing what I have to do right now as far as paying for my location. But and unless I plan on investing in a snowcat, I'm probably gonna be where I am.
I don't know. Maybe you want to be a part rental in a snowmobile.
Maybe, who
I don't
knows?
I've thought about hooking Radar up to a sled.
Shout out to Radar. He's a very good dog.
Your guest in this interview segment today is Kathleen Bradbury, and she's a producer with Performance Today.
Yeah, and what we talked a lot about was being an ally. So far on Trilloquy, every guest that I've interviewed has been Black. Well, now, I thought it was a good time to sort of get a different perspective, from a white woman, and I'll tell you what kind of sparked this conversation. So at Sphinx, we both attended this panel discussion about changing the status quo, and you got representatives from the Met Orchestra as well as some of the quote unquote top schools, Juilliard. Maybe there was someone from Manus there. I'm not remembering right now, but anyway, in this conversation of changing the status quo, you had a stage full of white people, an audience full of people of color, ready to ask questions. And we had to sit here and listen to, and no shade, but we had to sit here and listen to them talk about how their what do you call it? Like their diversity techniques and their diversity initiatives in their school and all of this sort of thing. And it just brings up so many conversations, specifically concerning what it means to be an ally and when it's time to step up, when it's time to step back. I'll say going into that panel discussion, if I couldn't see people of color on stage in these high positions at these very well-respected institutions of classical music, I at least needed to hear from as many people in the audience as possible. And there's an app for these events called Slido, where you enter your question and it goes just into this queue that the hosts can that the hosts on stage can read. So the first thing I did, I didn't attach my name to it, but the very first thing I did was ask the question, why are there no black people up here on stage?
That was the top question too, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that was just the energy in the room, and there was a lot of time spent circling round and round, and at the end of the day, the role of an ally oftentimes is to step back and let the person that you're vying for have a chance to speak and have a chance to offer their perspective.
Yeah, Kathleen makes a great point of that too. And I think the fact of the matter is that you probably have a lot more allies out there than you know, and they don't know how to proceed. And so there might be withholding, not, you talk about stepping away and letting this person of color do their thing.
But where does that come from for you to say that there may be more allies out there than you think? Because from what I've seen in the past couple of years, it makes me think that there are more non-allies out there than I might think.
If I were to speak just for myself, I'm not going to say that I had a privileged upbringing, but I did have a sheltered one.
Mm-hmm.
And the neighborhood that I lived in, at school, it was a healthy mix. It was diverse. But growing up in a household where I did not hear racial slurs, I didn't hear stereotypes or, anything negative about other races. And so when I would go to school, it was fine. That I felt like we were all getting the same.
Well, then what was your relationship with bigotry and racism if you weren't experiencing that at home? Did you know that as a thing to exist? Because my challenge with a lot of allies is that they believe that racism is not systemic and bigotry does not exist on the scale that people think. That's always the argument that I hear from folks.
I don't think that I'm one to comment on that because I'm not experiencing it.
But I guess what I'm asking, did you have a concept of racism existing?
Not until much later.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
that's interesting to me.
Not until much later when, because when you go to junior high, all of a sudden you've got, 3 or 4 other schools that are joining you there. And that's where it became, because I started hearing other kids saying racist things and all these other different directions. And I tried to stay out of it. So why I'm saying that you probably have more allies out there than you realize, there's probably people like me who didn't confront it, who didn't have to deal with it too much. And now that we're in this situation where you can be identified as an ally, they don't know where to start. They don't know what is acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you intervene? Because they talk about it, like if you're on the bus and you see somebody being harassed, like if you see a Muslim person being harassed for their dress, that you're not, that some people say go over and sit by them and start asking them questions and intervene that way. And others say that you're not supposed to do that. I don't know what is correct.
So you feel like as an ally, the rules just aren't really,
clearly identified.
So what do you think your role is? Well, do you consider yourself an ally to let's say to the Black community? Do you consider yourself an ally in that regard?
All I can say, Garrett, is I'm trying. I really am trying, and I still make mistakes, but I think that it's going to take time. People are still going to make mistakes.
What you've made me think of is the idea of unconscious bias, and that that plays a big role in conversations like these as well. And I'll put myself out there by saying, I take the train pretty late at night to work, and there's a certain type of character that we're taught to be a little fearful
And
of,
stay away from, sure.
and sort of stay away from. And as I continue to grow and evolve, I make a point to not be afraid of my brother or my sister or whoever, and just to make sure that I'm really, walking what I talk, so to speak, because even as a Black person, we have to consider the idea of intersectionality. So, I'm a black person who's gay, and someone who is black may target me for
For
being
that,
gay,
right?
so or whatever it could be. There, I think I said a couple episodes ago that moving here to St. Paul was my first time seeing a lot of black people who are Muslims. The large Somali community here, and I'm sure they have faced issues from black people for that. So intersectionality is a thing. When you want to talk about allyship, and it really gets into a complicated conversation. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, for me, it boils down to just loving your fellow citizen, and really doing your best to make sure that you're presenting yourself authentically, and that you can be received and perceived authentically, and as an ally when you need to be, really stepping up and knowing when to speak, and really sitting back and knowing when to listen.
That's key. I think that that's key. And one of the things that you and Kathleen talked about that resonated with me is she talked about when you grow up in the system, it's hard to call out the things that are wrong. You don't see it, and I think that that's happening to a degree for me and for people that, like me, are trying to do better, and that we have a responsibility to make that happen.
And that is the point I always try to make. When we talk about allies, there's this conversation of patting them on the back for being an ally.
Yeah, the social warrior thing, I don't like that much.
And from my perspective, again, you're doing what you're supposed to do. We talk about equality, and then we talk about equity, and that equity piece is what we miss so much. Equity is understanding the space you hold and the role you play, both historically and when it comes to the future. There are certain privileges that we both have as men that women don't have, and it's our responsibility. It's our job to acknowledge that and offer space where we can, and we shouldn't get a pat on the back for that. When a white person goes to bat for a black person and quells racism that they see in their job or just in their everyday life, that is not a pat on the back moment as far as I'm concerned. It's a you being a decent human being moment.
You should be behaving this way anyway.
Right.
And now how it relates to music, you guys were talking about how we are in a position to share and show people that there is more out there than the Hot 100
of classical music. Yeah, or instrumental music or whatever. Yeah, when we talk about racism being systemic, I think classical music is a shining example. So when you turn on classical radio, 9.5 times out of 10, you're going to be hearing a piece of music by a dead white man, and that's just that, and that has just been built over the centuries, because who is in charge of everything surrounding classical music, from the programming, if you want to go all the way back in time, from the men who had access to careers in composition. Today, who's putting together an orchestra season. Who's compiling radio playlists. Not to put ourselves out there so much, but I feel like I have to insert as much blackness into what I present over the radio as possible, because it's just not there, and again that's something that we have to always work back toward, is making sure that that we're playing catch up in a way. All of the music that was being written over time, especially by women and people of color, is not in the canon, and it's up to us to create the taste, to create the canon. And I think Kathleen and I talk about that.
That is the next thing that I was going to bring up. We're in a position to be tastemakers.
Right.
We can say, okay, we're not going to play this Arcangelo Corelli Concerto Grosso number 14.
Yeah.
You know, you made a great point. Is someone having a driveway moment to this?
And
You know, there may
yeah.
be, but I am going to bet no.
No
that
shade
is
to
just me.
Corelli.
No, and it has its spot. But I mean, I think that every moment that we've got on the air is a precious spot to be able to make an impact, you know, and I think that we should be treating it that way. And that's why I wanted to play this quick segment from a woman composer. Let's talk about that too. We shouldn't even need to say woman composer, because as soon as I say the name, you're going to know.
Well, we shouldn't have to say it, but we do, because again, we're fighting against the status quo. Same for composers of color. You know, every time it's a black composer, I mention it. So, but this is a composer who is a woman who you say that I would know immediately.
Well, she's moving the needle.
Okay.
As far as I'm concerned, she's doing interesting sounding things that I think is going to get traction.
Well, let's take a listen then.
Now, even just from the opening few bars of that, she's got my attention.
Yeah.
And that ensemble's called Roomful of Teeth.
Yeah. I don't think I know this composer though.
It's Caroline Shaw is her name,
wow,
and that is the Saraband from her Partita. Mm-hmm. If you go on, they've done the Tiny Desk concert at NPR. They've got also to watch them perform live is hypnotic.
Yeah.
And the sounds that they're producing to me sound like it's almost electronic, like it's been circuit bended a little bit.
Yeah, there are a lot of people that, would hear that clip you just played and not think of classical music, but it is, as far as I'm concerned, and that goes into the conversation of how the phrase classical music has grown to represent what it does, and again, and I think there are lots of power structures involved with that conversation, even ones that deal with race. China and India have musical traditions that go back way further than anything that happened in Western Europe. If you want to go into Africa and all of the the percussive based music and the traditions there, it should be a scar on American classical music that it doesn't really engage the music of the indigenous populations as much as it should. It's still sort of novel to hear a piece featuring a Native American flute or a powwow drum or something, so, along with, changing playlists and trying to create a new taste for people and reshaping the canon, we also have to acknowledge that the phrase classical music itself has been whitewashed, for lack of a better word, and we need to include so much more into that canon, including music that sounds a lot like what you played there by Shaw, Caroline Shaw.
You talked about when you were on Need to Know. You talked a little bit about that.
Shout out to them. That was a great trip.
That was illuminating for me to hear you all sit and talk about it, especially since you were right up to speed with them on popular music and hip hop, and you talked about Nipsey Hussle and his passing and the big impact that he had.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you've got all this in your bag about classical music, and I love to hear how you brought them gifts to try to turn them on to classical music by customizing the music to each individual person. That was a nice touch.
Yeah, and we all have that. And again, Kathleen and I go into that. She is a white woman who is queer. So there's intersectionality there. There are certain challenges she has, despite the fact that she's white, along with those privileges. She has to deal with difficulties of traversing the industry of classical music as a woman, and then how being queer plays into that, and everything else that goes along with it. We all have so much baggage and so many experiences. The problem is there is a type of person and a type of experience, especially in classical music, that has been held above the rest. And I'm here to shatter that. I'm here to change all of that. And And it was great to speak with Kathleen about that and really get her perspective on how race plays into classical music as someone who is not a person of color, but someone who is very proudly an ally and someone who's interested in reaching these points of equity within our industry and beyond. So it seems to be becoming a bit of a trend that people ask, how free they're able to speak during my interviews. Katie and Delaney asked that, as did Kathleen. So this is well, first of all, I assured her that she could speak as freely as she wished, and this is where we got started. When I had a couple people on yesterday, that was also one of their first questions, like why, what am I allowed to say? What am I not allowed to say? Why do you think that's a thing that we even think about? Like, why is that even a question?
I think that when we're considering talking about race, audience is absolutely vital, because I guess the questions that I would bring up, or the comments that I would make about the impact or the experience would be very different. And it seems weird to say that too, just because we need to get to a point where we can talk about race in ways that are authentic across the board. But how I talk about race with my friends and what I'm learning is very different from what I would say to a group of people who I don't know, maybe we're having a more professional conversation.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is admitting what you don't know.
And even that word professional is kind of loaded.
Right.
Well, what does that mean? What is professional dress? What is professional decorum?
Yes.
What does that even mean?
Well, and a lot of that is, it's so tied up in class and race. And we don't even, if you grow up in a culture where you are taught to dress a certain way, or taught, even business casual. What does business casual mean?
Right.
I had to look that up and double check just because I'm an informal person. But you don't even stop to think about the potential barriers and whether or not things are accessible.
Yeah.
Until you hit a roadblock. And so for me coming here, I'm hearing about all sorts of roadblocks that I never personally experienced, and it makes me wonder, okay, what are the roadblocks that are preventing us from getting more diverse submissions for the show? Or what are the roadblocks that are preventing us from talking to more people of color?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's sometimes I can identify them. Sometimes having time is a roadblock.
Right.
But also sometimes having I was just thinking in the last session, okay, we have all of these wonderful organizations that are putting on concerts around the country, and yet we don't have recordings from them. So do they know that we exist and we're interested? And if so, how do we show interest? It'll require us to reach out.
Yeah.
And also recording.
Mm-hmm.
What are the resources for recording?
Well, let's take one step back and sort of define that word we. So let's rewind a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your relationship with classical music as an art form. How does that we as classical musicians or people who work in the classical field apply to you as far as your upbringing? When was the first time you heard classical music, or when did you begin to, sort of seek it out as a profession?
Mm-hmm. So I was raised in a family that loved music. And my dad sang in the church choir, and he was a musician, just kind of amateur for fun.
Yeah.
And then I started taking lessons, and I was really, I had a role model. Her name was Sarah, and
Shout out to Sarah.
Right, Sarah. She was so cool, and I wanted to be her. And now I acknowledge she looked like me. And all my teachers looked like me.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about my mentor, Jed O'Leary, today, and how many opportunities he gave me to not just learn how to play music, but how to teach and mentor other students. Mm-hmm. And someone took a chance on me and really, he really helped me figure that out and was just willing to go there.
Yeah.
And so that has always stuck with me. My path to working on a classical music radio station was not linear. I never intended to go into music for work. And so when I came back to classical music, that for me was very profound because I was coming from a writing standpoint, and like more of a creative standpoint from that end, like creating
and not writing as in like writing music, but writing as in
writing as like
prose.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so my focus the past like 6 years has been really like literature, identity, and kind of meaning making, and how that relates to basically like feminist systems and queer systems, and looking at gender and class and race and stuff like that. But like the race part has always been in there, but I haven't had as much experience or like conversations around that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And you know, I have to say, it's, you know, the subject of race, and I've been coming to the Sphinx Conference for years now in a, you know, from a performer's perspective, and you know, thinking about this conference in a, you know, media sort of way has really opened up some interesting ideas for me. You know, we say over and over again how uncomfortable it is to talk about race, but from my perspective, you know, the fact of the matter is that it's difficult for people of color too, especially people of color in classical music, because there are so many rules that we're expected to play by, and so many, you know, sort of status quos that we maintain either, you know, actively or passively. So really, you know, coming up through this system and then going back to call things out can be, you know, can be a challenge for sure. At least a challenge for me.
Yeah. Well, and I can see where that's like really triggering too, to just address the fact that some of these issues, especially with like getting people to feel like they belong in classical music, are so systemic, and they start way back beyond like, you know, beyond how your conservatory experience felt.
Yeah.
And like, you know, if we try to trace lines of power, it's like I feel like I'm hearing all of these really great ideas for people of how to be more inclusive and promote diversity, and they're very small targeted efforts, which are great for affecting change on a small level. But like, if we trace this through line, we're still having problems at the level above. We're still having people who, you know, I've been struck again at the lack of like positions of leadership that include people of color, and we have all of these organizations I'm seeing here where people are like, you know what, I'm going to create my own thing. And that's been really fruitful. And I just think about like all of the opportunities that organizations are missing out on because they're not actively and intentionally making space for people of color to have their voices heard.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And when you know, we also have to be really cognizant about the way we define classical music. I feel. I mean, my go-to example is the music of India and the music of China. You know, those traditions span back thousands and thousands of years, and as far as they're concerned, that's classical music. You know, and you can go to any continent. When I think about the music of Africa, I'm thinking more about percussive music, more so than melodic music. But that phrase classical music is just pinned down on the traditions of Western Europe. And something that's been explored at this conference a little bit is the fact that that canon, that Western classical music, was very actively and very specifically funneled to only showcase white men. And there are definitely examples from Western Europe and today, of course, that go outside of that. But, you know, when we say classical music, who are we talking about? We're talking about Mozart, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, you know, all of these white men who wrote, you know, very beautiful and very influential music. But it sort of, from my perspective, lives in a space and time that we only acknowledge. You know, that's it. And And it becomes a challenge for me even to, sustain this idea of the importance of classical music when it's so non-representative.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think there's nothing wrong to appreciating Mozart and Beethoven.
Shout out both of them. I love them.
Yeah.
Magic flute is my joint.
There's like a lot of really good stuff in the canon. However, when we're looking at systems of oppression, I spent a lot of time kind of pushing back on the literary canon when I was going through my schooling, and why can't we have some of everything, I guess, is part of it. And the other thing is, like, if we stick to what's safe, then we're missing out. Mm-hmm. And it really is a disservice to our audience of listeners. It's a disservice to the musicians who are creating this music and the composers who are creating this music. And also it's a disservice to history.
Yeah.
Like, in 50 years, I mean, what are people going to remember, and who are we lifting up now that will become part of our future canon? Like, we are building our canon, and we need to include people of color.
Absolutely. And we already, in a contemporary way, I feel like we've already sort of cemented so many non-classical artists into, the halls of fame, whether you're talking about Elvis or Beyonce. I think she's going to live in the history books forever.
Kendrick Lamar.
Yeah, definitely. And I struggle. I really struggle because so many of these systems that are upheld are upheld. Just the fact, and we just left a panel about. I forget. Oh, changing the status quo, mm-hmm. And it's hard for me to even remember the title of that panel because I don't think that was executed.
Yeah.
A challenge of the status quo. You had people representing some of the quote unquote top conservatories around the country, and that in itself is a perpetuation of the status quo. The idea that there is a top conservatory or top conservatories, because I didn't go to them, and I have fine. Yeah, I'm good. I've had careers that many of those students did not have.
Right.
And that's no shade to any of them, but it's just the fact of the matter is that there's so much more than what is already placed up on the pedestal, and you had a very visceral response toward the end of that panel, I understand.
Yeah, I did. So as a white woman at a conference for Black and Latinx musicians, I am in the minority here. It's not a situation that I often find myself in. Mm-hmm. And the first panel that I saw was about daring to dialogue. And really a lot of what I got out of that was, at what moments do we need to step back, acknowledge our privilege, and lift up the voice of others? And so I've been thinking about that all week, and about how when I go back to work, how I can, as a white woman, advocate and be an ally. And this panel comes up, and it's, leadership positions, and all of the people are white. And I'm like, this is just kind of weird that, obviously these initiatives at the schools for diversity, I mean, I would hope that they're not happening in like a little white silo. Like, where are the people of color who are helping out and like actually, building these programs?
Yeah.
And this was such a cool opportunity for these institutions to really give voice to people of color. So like, why can't you have someone who is Black being a representative of this school?
Mm-hmm.
And
I guess the question could be, would that be authentic though? Or are they just sending this person because
right,
this is Sphinx?
And you don't know their intentions.
Yeah.
But in this case, I feel like actions really spoke, because I was watching all of these Sphinx scholars and people who are here lining up at the microphones to ask questions.
People of color.
People of color. And all of these questions flowing in through Slido that were calling out the fact that there was no representation on this panel and asking, okay, what are you guys actually doing?
Yeah.
You know, and there were comments that were like, hey, there are lots of people in line wanting to ask questions and we can't get to them. And what was happening was you had 3 white people in significant positions of power taking up all of the airtime and just talking and talking and talking and talking and filling up that time without getting to the questions and the commentary of the people whose voices needed to be heard.
Yeah.
So for me, as a white woman, it was a profound realization of like what not to do, and where do we need to sit back and let people, you know, in some cases express their grievances. Mm-hmm. And I think that would have been more empowering to hear students and musicians and really allow them to take these leaders to task a little bit. Obviously, we don't need to turn it into like a bloodbath. But
do we not? I don't know.
I mean, maybe we do, because it just seems so representative of what I think a lot of organizations are experiencing.
Yeah.
Where like we say we're all gung ho about diversity, but then at the moment where people can really step up and talk, they're silenced because for some reason Joe Schmo needs to elaborate on all of his efforts. But
what do those efforts mean?
Right.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say I didn't attach my name to the question, but that top rated question at that panel was actually mine. You know? So for the people that weren't there, the name of the panel was challenging the status quo, and when the panel came out and I saw, all white people, and then a member of, the Met Orchestra, this other powerhouse, sort of status quo up on the hill institution, they didn't have to say anything for me to already recognize the problem that is existent right here in this moment.
Right. And I think also this is like an intersection of class. And that is, I think, going to be it's going to continue to be one of our biggest barriers for the classical music world, because there are people who do not want to give up their class privilege and who want to perpetuate their class privilege by making classical music seem exclusive.
And that was actually a conversation explored in a way at a panel we went to yesterday when Stanford Thompson, shout out to Stanford, he talked about building a table or asking people to get up from the table,
Yes.
proverbially speaking. What are your opinions on that? If there is, let's say there's a table that's representative of power and influence, is it better for some people to get up from that table to allow other people to have their own space, or should we be building our own tables and saying whatever they're doing their thing, we're over here?
I don't know.
Yeah. It's hard for me too.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, and that's kind of like one of my main takeaways is, if it really comes down to like who's responsible for fixing this problem, and I think a lot of the time the burden falls on people who are just now being invited to a place at the table, and that is its own level of trauma. And its own level of microaggression, I guess. Just like the fact that we're like, hey, okay, the classical radio, we're allowing more voices to be heard, but we're expecting them to do the work. Like, if we're all at the table together, are we all doing the work we need to do to deserve to be at the table?
I think that goes back to the question of intent and what is really behind a lot of people, participating in these sorts of conversations and doing this work.
Yeah. So I think it can be really empowering to create a new table. And I'm saying that as a queer woman, like, sometimes fitting into the status quo is like at some point we get fed up and we don't need to do that. And we deserve to have something that celebrates us. And I think about the Gateways Music Festival and just how like unapologetic it is. And that is creating a new table.
Yeah. Shout out to Lee Kuntz.
Yes. And so like if we create a new table, that's great. One of the problems that I struggle with then is like, okay, so how do we? I mean, like, how do we bring the other table along then? You know, like I don't want it to be someone's burden to pull people into this state of like acknowledging that Black Lives Matter or like anything like that. Like I don't want it to be a burden on someone, but at the same time, like we have a responsibility. And I say we as white people, we have a responsibility to do the work to bring our other white people along, I think. And if we don't have everyone at the table, then that's going to be a lot harder because people who are resistant to being at the table with people of color are not going to see that it's important to have everyone's voices.
And they can just go ahead and get up, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, this is right. Yeah. So, and like even as I'm talking about this, I'm like, God, I don't know, and I feel like I don't have the authority to talk about this.
And you know, to be honest, that's the way I feel oftentimes when it comes to many issues. You know, I'm a soldier for really putting more diversity into classical music as far as race, but I also believe in gender equity, and there are a lot of conversations there that I just, you know, sit out on. I listen. You know, it's not like I'm ignoring the conversations, but I definitely, you know, take, you know, I'm on the sideline making sure that I'm able to understand and I'm able to learn, but that I'm not co-opting, and that tends to, you know, be what happens so often. It's all about recognizing when each of us are in that privileged position, and when we should just, you know, sit back and listen.
Yes.
And we've got a long way to go, don't we?
Yeah.
Especially in classical music, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, I think that for me, and kind of what I've heard from some of my white colleagues, the intention, like, is good. Right? Like we want to program more works by musicians of color.
Well, what do they say about good intentions? That's the road to hell is lined with good intentions.
Yeah, exactly. So like I think sometimes we just don't know where to start. And for me, starting is always with stepping back and listening and learning, and making sure that I'm not forcing people to do additional emotional labor to get me to the place I need to be.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to expect someone to teach me everything. Like, I need to actively seek out resources to get myself to a level where I can move beyond listening and actually move into a more effective allyship. Mm-hmm. And so I think going forward for me, I'm going to be looking at ways that I can do that. Ways that I can amplify voices who have not been heard, ways to challenge other white people to consider their actions and their intentions, and to really just kind of figure out how we can all talk about this to become more effective. Mm-hmm. Because so often, I think conversations of race end up with everyone being like, it's a tough conversation.
And that's where
shoulder
it is.
shrug.
Right.
Yeah. We're trying, which is great. But like, how can we move from trying to doing?
So, and I have to make it clear that, you know, Sphinx is doing incredible work, you know, and we're only having this conversation because we had, you know, sort of a critical reaction to something that happened, which in itself is important and I think very, very valuable to really think about how, once again, good intentions, how platforms set up to have these conversations can even miss the mark themselves. But in itself, it creates, really great conversations. I'm sure there are many aspects of Sphinx that have inspired you in a more positive way.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, like, I don't want to be a naysayer. I think that was the biggest learning point for me. For what not to do and how to improve. But I mean, first of all, seeing last night the Sphinx tank, seeing all of the, young, promising Black and Latinx entrepreneurs.
And that was the inaugural Sphinx tank. So just so that people know, like Shark Tank, at Sphinx Tank, at the inaugural Sphinx Tank, 3 individuals and 1 team presented ideas, that parlayed in some way with diversity, with culture, with race, and with classical music. So one of them won a $10,000 grant to fuel their project. I'm really excited to see where that project in particular goes. And there was also an audience choice, and everyone ended up getting a $1,000 grant to sort of help them on their way. And that spirit of being a leader and being an entrepreneur, especially, is sort of new in the world. I mean, it's not, there have always been entrepreneurs, but I've heard people much older than me say that this is a time when more people than ever are really trying to do their own thing and really trying to branch out and not punch someone else's time clock.
Yeah, and I thought that was really cool. I thought it was cool to see people's passion projects and really because I feel like you get to know someone through what they ask for money for.
Yeah.
And that sounds kind of, I don't know, but like if you really believe in something to the point where you are going to put, I mean, as much effort as these people have, I mean, these weren't just ideas, and I guess that's the big thing for me. They weren't just ideas. They were totally fleshed out. They were already in progress. They were just trying to make it to the next level.
Yeah.
And
it sucks that money is always attached to that next level.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Class.
Yeah, full circle.
And to hear the questioning of the panel, like, I mean, if anyone was in the audience last night, it was very clear this wasn't just a celebration of these entrepreneurs. Like, they were taken to task for what did their budget look like and what were the flaws. Mm-hmm. And it was a really professional, and like, there's that word again. Yeah. But like, it was a really legit thing.
Yeah.
And I think that in seeing a very fleshed out, it was legitimizing. And I think that people in the audience, if they had an idea, it could be like, hey, this will be taken seriously. Not just like, hey, I'm inspired by your work, but actually, no, I believe in you to the point where, like, I will consider giving you money.
Yeah.
And that was really, really powerful. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, seeing the performances has been fun too for me.
Yeah.
And talking to other musicians that, we haven't yet had on our show, but I'm like, we need to share this with our audience. You're doing great work, and how can we use our platform to amplify that?
And what do you think would be one of or some of the results of doing that? Let's say, performance today goes completely left field, and I think I'm thinking of rap as just as far away from the status quo as we could get when it comes to quote unquote classical radio and classical programming. And I think I've heard a little rap on PT before, but let's say there is, a hip hop symphony mm-hmm. that is, fully embodies the spirit of hip hop all the way down to subject matter and language, next to the symphonic sounds. Mm-hmm. What do you think presenting something like that would do? What do you think some of the results of that would be? I mean, of course, there are going to be people to turn off the radio, unfortunately.
Yeah. Which, I mean, you'll get that with anything. Like, I turn off the radio for some things. I'm like, I'm not going to pretend like I listen to everything that's on the radio. I think that if we intentionally curate a program that includes something in the left field, and we structure our program to really emphasize why it's relevant, then people might be more willing to be along for that journey. Like, if we want to take our audience and expose them to new stuff unapologetically.
But what, you know, one of the things I was thinking about is bringing in new listeners. I feel like something like that would get, you know, someone who may have never listened to Performance Today or public radio, classical radio. You know, they'll come in and feel like their perspective matters, and their, you know, their experience and their relationship with music matters, even to the orchestral stage, even to the concert stage.
Yeah, and I think that'd be awesome. And then that really would encourage us to question, like, should we emphasize our current audience or should we emphasize our potential new audience when we're programming? Like,
that's a conversation.
Yeah, do we do promising programming or comfortable programming? And like when we do a mix, how do we get our future audience to listen?
Yeah.
Like that goes down to marketing and how we engage with communities and audiences too.
There's so many pieces of the puzzle because you need, you know, you need a diverse set of people in marketing. You need a diverse set of people in the performance of the music and in the presentation of the music. And yikes, it's a lot to wrap your mind around, it seems.
It is. And I will say we did, a couple weeks ago, we had it was a symphonic piece that was EDM inspired.
Nice.
So it was
who's it by? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, I don't. But he had gone to the Electric Forest Festival. Like he had gone to a big music festival, and was really struck by kind of the marriage of technology and nature.
Yeah.
Because it's like this massive EDM festival in like redwoods. So you're like, what? And I know that we got some people who were not fans of that piece. But we also got a lot of really positive feedback where people are saying, hey, we want more of this. And I think that's the thing that we need to remember is there are always going to be people who are resistant to change and resistant to development. But for, you know, every one person who's a naysayer, there are a lot of people who want that.
Yeah.
And why not give that more? I don't know.
And I'm sure there's, you know, I'm sure there is an example to go against, you know, my point, but it seems like resisting change has never been, you know, the right side of anything. Like, when has resisting change or resisting evolution been seen in retrospect as something good? I mean, I'm not thinking of anything right now.
Yeah.
And I think that can certainly apply to the way classical music lives in our society, the way we think about what it is, the way we think about who it should be targeted to, and that could lead to so much.
Yeah. Well, and I'd like to see it, you know, continue to exist in the land of the living. And even if we're playing music by people who are dead, where is the focus? Is it on a history lesson? Is that history lesson important to helping us understand the future and what's going on now? Or is that history lesson kind of perpetuating the glorification of the masters who have gone before and then setting current people up to always be measured against that?
Right.
Like, I don't know if that even...
No, I definitely know what you mean. Okay. So sort of validating the sound of today's music based on, you know, the music of yesteryear, yester century.
Right.
Even within the umbrella of classical music.
Yeah, and
or what
at
we
this
call
point, it's so different.
Yeah.
Like, so how do you compare apples to oranges? It's like, I'm not going to compare the nutrition advice from the 1800s to like what we understand about nutrition in the body now.
Yeah.
And
I do prefer oranges, for the record.
So like, you know, we don't need to erase our past. We need to acknowledge it. And you know, Quanice was having this great project with it, celebrating the past and understanding where our future has seeded from.
Yeah. And shout out Quanice, Arts Administrators of Color.
Super great. And I think that we all need to acknowledge our musical roots. But when we say musical roots, that needs to include like stuff beyond the Western canon, because there are so many influences at this point in classical music that are not the canon. So how do we look at our history, our collective musical history in classical music as a genre, to include jazz, hip hop, folk music, because those are roots.
Yeah. Country, God help us.
Yeah.
Just joking.
Gospel.
Just joking. Gospel. Yeah.
I mean,
of course.
There's so much, and all of these threads are coming into our current music, our current genre, and yet we still have this thread line that's only focusing on one root of the tree.
So as you leave Sphinx and return back to our very chilly home in St. Paul, Minnesota, what can you think of for yourself as being step one? What is the first thing you're going to do when we get back to work to sort of propel this idea of equity and cultural competency in classical music as it applies to what we do?
Yeah, so I have a lot of reflecting to do, and I think that's the ultimate first step, is that I have to put in the work to think about what did I learn, what felt uncomfortable, like where did I feel personally challenged, and why. And so I'm gonna be doing a lot of thinking on the plane, and then I need to figure out, okay, what in my current role can I do to advocate for being more inclusive, and celebrate musicians of color, and really validate the authentic and legitimate and valuable work they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first step. What can I personally do? And then I would really like to figure out how I can talk to other people who are also white about race issues in our jobs. Where are we improving? Where do we need to improve? What does that look like? And like, what are the barriers that are preventing us from doing the work? And I think at some level we all know that this burden of change has unfairly fallen on the shoulders of people of color. But it's really sinking into me that, like, if we are in institutions that are still predominantly white and we're expecting the change to be sloughed off onto the shoulders of people of color, like, that is, first of all, not fair. It's incredibly traumatic to be, like, forced to have that role all the time, and it's not going to necessarily change as much as we need it to. So identifying these barriers of, like, why are we as white people not being as effective allies as we can be? And how can we get to the point where we can really affect change? Yeah,
move the needle. And you know, while I agree that the onus should not fall on Black people as a populace to fix these systemic issues, the role that I feel like I have to take is to not allow my experience and my voice and my relationship with classical music to be invalidated in any way. Mm-hmm. If I like this because of this, you know, that's okay. You know, I love the symphonies of William Grant Still because, first of all, he was a Black man who overcame, you know, the challenges of the early 20th century, you know, as a Black man from the South, from Arkansas. He incorporated spirituals and blues, and that's music that I have a relationship with, and that's why I like this. And I don't think there's any need to validate that beyond that. I think Black people, we really need to make sure we're not allowing ourselves to be invalidated by the way we acknowledge our art and our history in the wider conversations.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me. You want to tell the listeners how they can listen to your show and what it is and all that?
Yeah, so I'm an associate producer for PT, Performance Today, and you can listen to us on the web if you prefer, and that is always available 2 hours every day. It's at yourclassical.org/performance today. Ooh, I remember that. And also, you can listen to it on your local radio station.
Yeah.
So it's carried around the country. It's fun 2 hours. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll see you back in St. Paul.
Yes, thank you.
Kathleen Bradbury in conversation with Garrett McQueen here on Trilloquy. And I have to say, the phrase that comes out of there for me is the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah. So, we got to make sure, we have to check what we're doing beyond what we intend. And I think that's what that means at the end of the day.
And I also think that we also have to be courageous enough to go, where can I help? What can I be doing?
And if you want to be an ally, be prepared for the honest answer. And quickly before we go, I'll give the example. I was listening again to the Need to Know podcast. Shout out to Steph Savon and Alex. They had on a guest who kind of went into the conversation of what does it mean to be an ally, and what would you tell a white person looking to help out in her black run in her very equitably black organization. And what she said was she would tell the white person to go find a black person who is qualified for the position that they want. So sometimes being an ally isn't comfortable. Sometimes being an ally doesn't immediately benefit you, but that's what it means, and that's the point we need to get to. And with folks like Kathleen, I think we're making strides, certainly in the world of classical music.
Now, next week, we're not going to do an opus proper like we have been. We're going to do like another overture of sorts.
Right. So next week, there's a very important holiday called Juneteenth. What do you know about Juneteenth?
Next to nothing.
Okay, well, on June 19th, back in 1865, a general rode down to Galveston, Texas, and announced the end of the Civil War, and that is what we remember as the bit of what freed the slaves. So after that, it was official that slavery in America had ended, and to this day, black folks across the country celebrate that as the day our ancestors were freed. But were we freed? Are we free? And those are conversations we're going to have next week.
So be listening for another overture, intermezzo, and tracked sort of installment of Trilloquy.
Yeah, we're breaking the chains next week, so I hope y'all will see you there.
Be on the listen.